So the presentation is called Mobile is Eating the World, and there's four things that I'm going to touch on. One is the scale and the nature of the shift from the desktop internet to the mobile internet. The second is to dip a little bit into what's happening with tablets. And then the third and fourth are to go into the evolution of handset and device ecosystems and how those interact with service discovery and with social. So looking very quickly at devices, this shows you PC sales over the last 10, 12 years or so compared with tablets. And you see a nice steady growth in PC sales, slowing off in the last couple of years as tablets explode up from the bottom. But if you zoom out and then look at what's happening with smartphones, you see where the real growth is coming from. Over 600 million sold last year and probably over 1 billion sold this year. If you zoom out again, you can see the scale of the overall mobile handset business, which sells about 1.7 billion units a year. And that industry is in the process of converting almost in its entirety to smartphones. And so if you pull those numbers together and compare PCs with mobile devices, you can kind of see where all the growth is coming from. In 2013, about 1.25 billion tablets and smartphones will be sold on Earth, as opposed to 325, 350 million PCs. So there's a fundamental change in the scale of the devices that are being sold. If you skip forward a couple of years to 2017, you can see what the global population is going to look like. About 4.5 billion literate adults, of which about 4 billion will have mobile phones, and something over 3 billion will have smartphones. So a massive growth in the scale of the ownership of mobile internet devices, far outstripping the install base of PCs. And that changes everything. Mobile was always much bigger than the PC industry, but it was always completely separate. And what smartphones have done is broken down the wall between the two, so that all of a sudden the consumer technology industry is growing into the mobile business, and the mobile business is being changed by smartphones. And so just to compare those, as I said a moment ago, 350 million PCs sold a year, but 1.7 billion phones. And the PCs are replaced every 5 years, and they're shared, and the mobile phones are replaced every 2 years, and they're carried everywhere. And so that leads to a fundamental change in use. The PCs are shared, they're not portable, they're mainly just used for the web and web search, whereas mobiles are personal, they're taken everywhere, and they're used for a very wide range of different interaction options, web and web search and apps, but also a lot of other things that are happening on those devices as well. So there's a change in the scale of usage, but also in the complexity of use. What that means is that you go from mobile internet being something reserved for early adopters. This is a photograph. The man on the left is Mark Andreessen, who created Netscape, which some people in the room are probably old enough to remember, and the two others are his partners. That takes us through to this, which is a shot from the Sun newspaper in the UK. Betting shop worker Siobhan says, "I love reading about TV soaps, so I got the app on my smartphone." That's what we really mean when we talk about 3 billion, 3.5 billion people on Earth having smartphones. It's not the people in this room, it's everybody in this city and everybody in this country and everyone on this continent. To look at its scale, I think it's kind of instructive for people to have a sense of where they sit with the companies that they're working with. So the mobile industry on Earth does about $1.2 trillion of revenue every year. That's a little over double the size of the global advertising business, which is about $500 billion. If you then scale all the way down and look at things like recorded music or even online advertising, you see a much, much, much smaller scale. And so you have a succession of industries, a very small scale, sitting on top of much larger businesses around mobile and mobile devices. That's where all the money is. When you then look at the manufacturers, you can see a polarization. So you have Samsung and Apple, which are the two blocks on the left, making effectively all of the money. Then you have, so to speak, the 6 or 7 dwarfs in the middle who are all subscale and shrinking, and some of those are going to disappear. And then you have a surge of Chinese manufacturers over on the right. And the reason this matters is if you look at this chart, which compares the volume on the vertical axis with the price of the device on the horizontal axis. So the horizontal axis is the average selling price for a phone by manufacturer. And so what you see is Apple is selling out devices at an average of $575. Samsung is selling 3 times as many at a half or a third of the price. And then everybody else in the industry is being squeezed out, and the only other growth sector is, quote, other Android, unquote, which means Chinese and Indian manufacturers in emerging markets. So you have kind of a divergence in the industry between Apple, which is camped out at the high end, and everybody else who's selling much higher volumes at lower prices, generally to quite different customers. If we then look into tablets, you can see much the same kind of effect, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail. This shows you tablet sales and how they've been surging in the last 2 years relative to PC sales, which have been shrinking. Now, that's not a direct cannibalization. It's not that people are buying buying a tablet instead of a PC. It's more that people are postponing a PC purchase, or they're considering whether they need a new one or how many they need for their family, and they're substituting the usage of those devices to tablets and smartphones much more quickly than they're substituting the purchase. So you have a 3 or 4 year old PC in the home that becomes a 5 or 6 or 7 year old PC in the home, as the majority of that household's usage migrates to tablets and smartphones. If you then split out the tablet sales, there's 2 stories here. This shows you iPad sales against sales of Android tablets. The pink block on top is Android tablets in China, which don't connect to any Google services, and the orange is, the green and the orange are Android tablets. A large part of the decline in iPad sales here, incidentally, is product cycle, because Apple hadn't had a new device in 9 months, so it's not necessarily a sort of a structural problem. But if you then look at the usage, this is data from Adobe, but I could show you a dozen variants on the same chart. You see 80 to 90% of tablet web usage coming from iPad. And when I talk to publishers in the UK, they say actually it's more like 90 to 95% usage. And the reason for this is that you actually have 2 tablet markets. You have a tablet which is being used for the post-PC vision, as outlined by Steve Jobs and copied by Google, which is a $200, $250 plus device with a rich range of apps and a lot of interesting products on it. And probably 3/4 of that market is iPad, maybe more. And then you have $100 generic black plastic Android tablets being sold in China and emerging markets, and to lower-income groups in the West, in much, much higher volume, but with a totally different usage profile. And those are not being used for the web, they're not being used for apps, they're mainly being used for TV and for free games, and as kids' tablets, and to prop up wobbly tables, and as DVD players, and a whole range of other products, but not actually for the same thing that the Nexus or the Galaxy Tab or the iPad are being used for. So there's a really radical polarization within the tablet market. And this chart just illustrates one of the drivers of that, which is price. You can get a good Android phone for less than half what you'd have to pay to get an iPhone, but the entry price for a tablet, for an iPad, is much lower. So there's much less of a price incentive to go for Android in the tablet space. And equally, if you look at the divergence in apps, there's pretty much parity in apps on Android and on iPhone, in smartphones, but in tablets, Android tablets are much, much weaker. So you have a very, very strong self-selection effect in the tablet market. People who want to do apps and want to go online with tablets buy iPads by and large. People who want to do different things buy Android tablets. Just a final point here. This is some data from Flurry that points to the problem of definitions. The big green block on the lower right, so each of these blocks breaks out Android devices by screen size. And so if you look globally, most Android devices are phones, and there's a relatively small number of tablets and what are called phablets, so the sort of Galaxy Note, the 5, 6, 7 inch, the phone that looks like it's too big to use. In South Korea, almost half of all the devices being used are phablets. So you have this divergence between what size of device people want to use, how they want to use it, and that varies quite a lot by market. In 2013 overall, well over 200 million tablets will be sold on Earth, driven by size and price. And as I said, that diverges between a flood of cheap generic Android tablets that are not being used for online experiences, and then another segment which is mostly iPad with some Samsung and some Nexus, which is being used for the kind of things that people in this room are interested in. Looking at ecosystems, there's 4 companies that are driving the agenda in mobile and in the internet today: Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. I'm not really going to talk about Amazon, but I'm going to talk about Google, Apple, and Facebook. Looking at the sizes of those companies' ecosystems, an ecosystem is really the key leverage point for them. You see, again, an enormous volume. So Facebook and Android both have close to 900 million mobile users. And this is just Google's Android, so there's another 300 or 400 million Android users in China. Amazon obviously is not present globally, so it has a relatively small number of users compared to the others. And Apple, because as I said earlier, tends to camp out at the high end of the market, has a relatively small number of users, but still about 400, 450 million users of iOS on Earth. If you translate that into reach, which is not the same thing as value, this shows you the global internet audience. About half of the audience is PCs out of China, another 15% is PCs in China, which most of us can't address, and then about a quarter of that is either Android or iOS outside of China. So you have for the first time, particularly for a company like Google, the internet overall is on a PC is less than half of the audience. So the internet outside China is less than half the audience. There's also a huge amount of geographic variation within that. So this is data from Facebook on how their mobile users spread. And so if you look at the UK or the US, you see high smartphone penetration, and you see a fairly even split between iPhone and Android. Android, you'll notice, is roughly 50% Samsung, most places on Earth, some places more than that. But in the US and the UK, you see roughly a 50-50 split between iPhone and Android. If you look at a market like Spain, if you look at markets that are more prepay, that tend to have that are lower or mid-income, then you see much more Android and relatively less iPhone, simply because fewer people want to spend $650 on a phone, or the equivalent thereof embedded in a contract. And then when you go to a market like Indonesia or Brazil, there's almost no iPhone. And in fact, in Indonesia, uniquely, there's still a lot of BlackBerry, although that's disappearing very fast. You may also, if you squint, manage to just make out a little bit of Windows Phone in here at the top. That's the blue bar. I had to do quite a big chart in order for that to show. So as I said earlier, the driving point for all of these businesses is the ecosystem. And for Apple, the ecosystem is about selling devices. It's not about making money. For everybody else, it's the other way around. The device is the entry point for the ecosystem. And for most of those ecosystems, that means apps. So this gives you cumulative app downloads on iOS and Android. Apple stated 60 billion cumulative downloads of apps on iPhone and iPad in the last quarter. Android is probably at about the same place, so 120, 130 billion cumulative app downloads over the last 5 years. People like apps. Within that, Apple and Google have won, but that doesn't mean that the conversation is over. Apple is camped out at the high end, Android has taken the rest, but the nature of Android is very fluid. We have Amazon and Facebook trying to extract value. Samsung's intentions for Android, and Samsung has half of all Android devices, are very unclear. Google's own intentions for Android are unclear, so this situation remains rather fluid. I think one thing that I want to pull out, though, is that there's a very different nature in the character of the innovation for these two companies. Because Apple controls the entire device, it can roll out updates to its software extremely quickly. So what this chart shows you is the number of live devices running each version of the operating system. Apple has about 300 million devices running iOS 7, and about 150 million running last year's version of iOS. If you look at Google, on the other hand, they've been rolling out versions of Android this year, and they've got 10 or 20 million users of them. And actually, they have a much greater lag in the adoption of any software services that they roll out within Android. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, as I can sort of go into later. But it means that the level of innovation, the places where Google and Apple innovate, sort of sit differently. Because Apple integrates the hardware and the software, it pushes integration into the hardware and the software. It does local wireless. It does fingerprint scanning. It puts 64-bit chips in the devices. And that's a place that's hard for Google to compete because it doesn't control the device. Conversely, Google is all about innovation in the cloud and innovation in internet services, which is a hard place for Apple to compete. So the two, in effect, are competing outside of the other's comfort zone and providing innovation in different parts of the stack. If you then pull back to what that means for usage, on iOS, about 2 billion downloads of apps every month, about $1.1 billion spent on the App Store every single month. And the average iOS device downloads 4 to 5 apps every month and spends about $2 on the App Store every month, the majority of that in games. So it's a smaller base, but it's a much more engaged base, which is a function of it only being on $600 and $700 devices. If you look at Android, on the other hand, maybe the same, maybe slightly more downloads for 4 times the number of users. An average of maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 apps downloaded per device per month, and much, much lower payment rates, although we don't actually have any data from Google on that. So at a high level, the Android ecosystem is probably 4 times the size of iOS. Certainly Android phones are 4 times the size of iPhones as a user base. The download rates, the total download rates are about the same, the payment rates are much lower. So it's a question of reach versus value in anybody's consideration of what they're going to target and what they're going to do on each. This chart, this diagram, just tries to draw that out, really, that you need to think about devices in terms of a curve of engagement and interest. The high-end devices have high engagement because Apple only sells high-end devices. Apple devices have high engagement, and there's some Android there as well. And then you have a curve shading all the way down to a $30 or $40 Android sold to a farmer in a village in Kenya who is probably not going to be spending 3 or 4 hours a day watching YouTube and probably doesn't have a LinkedIn profile, although I'm sure there'll be an option for him to upload pictures of his cows at sort of some point in the future. So looking at mobile social, I think the thing that there's a couple of observations to make here, and then I'll hand over to questions. The first is, I don't think everyone really understands quite how big mobile social has become. So the bar on the left here shows you Facebook's mobile users, which is getting on for 900 million users. WhatsApp, this chart, it's changing so fast, this chart is now out of date. WhatsApp now has 350 million users. And WhatsApp users are sharing 400 million photos a day. Facebook users are sharing 350 million photos a day. And then there is WeChat with over 200 million users, Twitter with over 200 million users. There are probably a dozen mobile social apps with over 100 million users, all of them being used to chat and exchange information and talk about brands, pass links around, pass music around, pass pictures around. If you then look at how young people are using them, this is survey data from the UK. UK 12 to 15-year-olds, on average, send about 250 SMSs every week, but also send close to 200 messages a week using WhatsApp or BBM or Line or Viber or Kik or some combination of these other services. So you see massive volume of usage in parallel to SMS, some of which is Facebook, some of which isn't. And the driver for all of this is that the dynamic of social on a mobile phone is totally different from on the desktop, because you can access the phone book, because you can access push notifications, you can access the photo library. It's much, much easier to switch between social networks. I just sort of jump forward on time. So there's much less friction. And the dynamic really is that these products are sticky like nightclubs rather than being sticky like banks. People go to the one that their friends are in and they change, and they go to several. There's much less resilience in Facebook on mobile than there is in Facebook on the desktop. LinkedIn is obviously a slightly different dynamic because there's kind of unique content there. So if you look again at data from the UK, but this is something that we see around the world, what this chart shows you is UK 15 to 24-year-old use of social on their mobile device. So 11% sadly lack a smartphone as yet. The other 90% have a smartphone. Around 3/4 are using social apps on their smartphone. Over 3/4 are using social apps on their smartphone. Half are using more than one. So they're all using Facebook, or almost all using Facebook, but most of them are using something else as well. Now, that doesn't mean that Facebook is in trouble. This shows you Facebook's revenue by source. And in the September quarter, Facebook's mobile ad revenue was almost 50%. I think it was 49% of their advertising revenue. So it's not like Facebook isn't succeeding on mobile. It's just not the only thing on mobile anymore. In other words, you can ask the question, is the mobile opportunity so big that it actually doesn't matter to Facebook that it's not the only thing that's happening? It's just the first amongst equals. And the dynamic is that people are unbundling different bits of the Facebook experience. So they're unbundling chat, they're unbundling photos, they're unbundling music into separate apps. But what they're also doing is they're using all of these apps for everything. So they're using Instagram for chat, they're using Snapchat for chat, they're using WhatsApp to share pictures. So you have these very complex overlapping diagrams of all the different apps that people might use and how they might use them. Just to leave you on a couple of points, all of this stuff is still changing, and it's changing very fast. Facebook nailed the desktop social experience. Nobody has nailed the mobile social experience at all. And what all of these companies are trying to do is create a platform. So they're trying to go beyond just sharing pictures or text between individuals and move to becoming a distribution platform in the way that Facebook is a distribution platform on mobile. I think so they're using things like Twitter cards, which you see on the left here. The illustration on the right is actually a Google Now card as a way of turning content into packets that can be shared dynamically, embedded within different social networks, passed to and fro between different people, disaggregated or atomized or split apart from the underlying piece of the content. But of course there's a parallel trend. So you have atomized content on the one hand, but you also have silos of content. So you have apps that you spend 30 minutes inside and can't get into or can't link into or can't share content from. But again, All of this is all of this is, sorry, let me spin. There we are, that's a slide to leave you on, we'll go to questions. Basically, all of this is changing really fast. The mobile, the interaction model for the desktop internet was kind of done by the late 90s. It was the web, and you might have an email program, but basically used a web browser. On mobile, you have half a dozen interaction models already, and those interaction models are all changing and all being rediscovered and all being reinvented, which is why Snapchat, for example, is supposedly attracting a $4 billion valuation on zero revenue. And that's I'll leave it at that and open up to questions.